Welcome. My name is Chris Wahl, the Chief Technologist at Rubrik, and this is a session that's going to be nerdy. We're going to technically deep dive into our integration with Acropolis. Maybe we can get that speaker to turn off there. I keep hearing myself out of it, the one up here. That'd be wonderful. Let me use this apparatus here. There we go. That's me. I converse about cloud-native applications with llamas in Amsterdam. It's kind of a side project. These are the places that I exist on the web, most notably the Datanauts podcast, which I run every week with my co-host Ethan Banks. We talk about silos and busting them and things like that. You're welcome to partake, as well as wallnetwork.com, which is my blog. Right, so that's all I'm going to say about me. Rebecca, who are you?
My name is Rebecca Fitzhugh. I work with Chris. I'm a technical marketing engineer at Rubrik. Like Chris, you can find me on the interwebs. That's it.
Yeah, we'll keep it pretty to the point. Cool, so there's a lot of content to deliver in a very short period of time, so let's get to it. I just wanted to set the table a little bit about Rubrik. If you want to know more about Rubrik, obviously we're here as a sponsor. We're right next to the Nutanix booth in the sponsor expo, Solutions Expo area, just to the left of it. So happy to go deep there. But realistically, Rubrik was formed around the idea that backup kind of sucks, right? No one's like, woo, backup, I'm gonna get a tattoo saying how much I love it, right? And that's because pretty much forever it's been this kind of architecture. Right, having to build backup like artisanal cheese, like handcrafted, putting all these components together. There were some minor changes that occurred within the last decade or so with deduplication and using storage targets and things like that. I'm sure you're all well versed with this because we've all had to deal with backup. I have my scars as a systems administrator over the years of dealing with that. But realistically, the idea was that you had to put this architecture together yourself and hope it works, because typically you don't test it until you really need it, right? So the idea was, at Rubrik, what if we could take all of these components, distill them into software, which is probably a story that resonates and sounds very familiar to you, and deliver that as initially an appliance, and later on a virtual appliance and a cloud cluster, right? So with Rubrik, what you're actually buying when you deploy the appliance on premises is a 4-node piece of hardware that's running our software on it. It comes with all the software to do backup and recovery and archive and replication, all that kind of jazz. There's no kind of piecemeal activities you have to do. And then you scale it as necessary. So it's very similar to the Nutanix story in that it's kind of a node-based, shared nothing, scale out, kind of web scale system, but for backup, recovery, archive, replication, and kind of your data management needs. Right? And instead of having to use tape as your majority placement for data, you can use public or private cloud, object store, file store, whatever makes sense for you. So at the end of the day, what does this architecture kind of look like? What does it actually look like when you put it in the data center? Well, if you have an hour, that's pretty much start to finish from the box to actually taking backups that can be recovered, the entire process. You have your Nutanix environment running in one or more data centers. You can start with one brick, which is our physical appliance or our cloud cluster, or whatever makes sense for you. It's actually going to talk to the various APIs of what you have in your environment. So that may be something like talking to the Acropolis hypervisor, talking to the vCenter server, et cetera. And it's going to give you a landscape of all the different objects in your data center. Virtual machines, the workloads that are going on, NAS, if you're attaching to storage. If you're doing physical backups, we can connect to physical servers running Linux, Windows, SQL, that kind of jazz. So it's going to list all that into the inventory view. That's pretty quick. Then, because it is a node-based scale-out distributed system, all of the backups are pretty peppy. They're ingesting into Flash in parallel across the nodes. And the system's smart enough to figure out how best to do that to one global namespace. So you're not having to dictate this particular backup goes here, this one goes there. Logically, it all just looks like one object from a Rubrik perspective. Beyond that, there's no jobs to create. You don't have to go in there and sweat like a blacksmith creating backup jobs, trying to figure out how that all works. You actually take your business's SLA requirements for the recovery point objective, RTO, availability, retention, that kind of jazz. You bake it into an SLA domain, which is a policy, and you associate policy to objects, which are virtual machines and databases and whatever that might be, right? The system then figures out how to take those backups. If you want to recover, which is often the missing component within most vendors' stories, they just focus on how many gigabits per second they can ingest out of a data store, which doesn't really matter. You want to know how quickly I can recover. It's pretty much near zero, right? So we can instantiate an entire virtual machine, a SQL database, things like that, in a second or two. From a VM perspective, the only time beyond that is the boot time of the workload. And that's going to be presented across our Flash tier back into your primary environment. So actually presented to something like Nutanix or your VMware environment or whatever that might be, right? So that's going to be super quick from a file, folder, or entire virtual machine and database perspective. And it's all searchable, right? You can use, and it's all secure, right? End-to-end encryption. From the moment we grab the data, it's all encrypted across the wire, at rest using software or hardware, your choice, including going to an archive location and at rest in the archive location. So you don't have to worry about any kind of gaps within that process of getting data out of the primary system and into your archive. And you can choose where you actually want to start running some workloads after you've taken backups, right? So recently within our Alta release that just came out, we just launched that last week, I believe, or a week or two ago. What you're able to do is take backups on premises of virtual machines using VMware today, and more use cases will be expanded as we go forward, and run those in EC2 on Amazon. Right? So you can actually send workloads to the cloud or actually start instantiating those using our cloud on technology in the cloud. Right? So it takes basically old and busted, get rid of it, new hotness. That's the pitch there. I thought I'd get a little more of a chuckle than that. I'm a little disappointed with this room. There was a bunch of snacks out there. I think you might have missed the ice cream or the coffee. But obviously, just being able to scale out one tier being Rubrik for the on-prem, quick RTO type activities, and then using public, private, or hybrid cloud for the archive, it's easy, right? And removing complexity is obviously what we want to do as architects within the data center. From an architecture perspective, everything within Rubrik is actually based on a set of native seamless APIs. Right? So the product actually talks between itself, between the nodes and one another using the API. We expose that same API to you so that anything you see or do within the user interface can be automated because, hey, if you open up developer view within Chrome as an example, you hit F12, you'll see all the calls we're making. Right? So there's no hidden back channel. You don't have to install Java because everyone loves doing that. Or some kind of thick client on a Windows box. Right? It's all just running HTML5 talking APIs basically on the back end. So any of these use cases can be supported and automated, which is quite fancy. I alluded a little bit earlier to the Alta release. We had a lot of cool stuff introduced with that release. We actually support Acropolis in our 4.0 release called Alta, as well as Hyper-V. So if you're running Acropolis, Hyper-V, or VMware ESXi on your Nutanix environment, they are all supported, in addition to a plethora of other items there. Focusing specifically on the enterprise cloud messaging around Nutanix, you all get it, right? I actually first saw Nutanix in 2011, and I was like, D-Raj, you're kind of crazy, but I like it. And then now it's like, this thing's everywhere. Everybody's loving the Nutanix story. But the idea is you take what's now today, you got the, with Calm and blueprints and things like that that are going to be talked about later today, or just your actual applications running in Nutanix. You can then run those on your primary environment. We'll take the backup. We'll allow you to push that app wherever it needs to go, for DR, test dev, things like that, those various use cases, and make sure that we can instantly recover it to any environment that you wish. So you may have a DR site that is running disparate amounts of hardware, right? And that's totally fine, right? So it makes the service delivery workflow much easier. Just to overview some of the tech bits before I get into the API parts. Support for AHV is pretty in-depth. We've offered a lot of features for the VMware customer for a long time, and we're pretty much bringing those feature for feature to the Nutanix Acropolis hypervisor user. So when I talked about making SLA domains and policies to protect objects within the environment, that includes the virtual machines running in your Acropolis environment. You can do that quick backup and restore, ingested parallel to Flash. You can do the quick restore of data, basically whenever you need it. You can export the environment from one instance to another. Rebecca's going to do an actual live demo of that, et cetera. Basically, if you want it, we got it. There you go. And you don't have to just pick something that only supports Acropolis because we support the rest of the ecosystem as well. Cool? Jazzed up? It's a little cold in here, right? Man. We also have some swag to give away later, too, if you have questions and t-shirts and things like that. So that was my marketing stuff. I'd like to take that hat off, which feels a little weird and scratchy on my head, and put on the nerd hat, which is much more comfortable and worn in. And talk about how do we do this, right? What do the RESTful APIs look like with Acropolis? Because this is where I started to get interested. And what I want to do is break down the workflow. Like, okay, how do you protect workloads with Acropolis? Like, what does the API workflow look like? Because I feel like in the data center, API knowledge is power. And as infrastructure engineers, myself included, I've had to spend a lot of time learning APIs and how to talk to them and how to put them into workflows and things like that. So the workflow, I apologize if it's a little small, white on different colors. There's a lot of things that are going on that you don't ever have to touch, right? But I thought it'd be interesting to see how does this actually work. So you kind of start at the top and you follow the maze, and that's what's going on every time you're taking a backup. And I'm going to break these down a little bit because I thought it was kind of cool. The first thing is, from a Rubrik perspective, I put a little snowflake thing, that's our Rubrik logo, on API calls that are specifically being handled by Rubrik, like what we're doing. And if you don't see the snowflake, it's kind of what Acropolis is doing. So from an adaptive throttling perspective, we're looking at the workload to make sure, are we going to hurt this thing by taking a backup? Is that going to hurt the I/O that the VM is seeing or the data store is seeing? Is that going to hurt the CPU usage, things like that? So we make sure that we're not hurting the environment, and that's all auto magic, right? Because you don't want to, it's impossible to monitor that at scale. There's no way your hands can do that. We then allow you to inject any kind of scripts you want into the environment. If you have a pre-freeze type script or something you want to quiesce prior to taking the snapshot, that's cool. We then call AOS's new v3 APIs, which specifically support change block tracking and granular VM backups and things like that. So we say, hey, Nutanix, Acropolis, can you actually create a snapshot for this workload for us? And it, of course, obliges with a tip of its hat and a nod of its monocle. It says, yes, absolutely, I can do that. We can then do what's called the change region tracking, which is new with v3 APIs. It's change block tracking, basically, or something of that nature, saying, okay, what changed? And CRT is actually pretty awesome because it's very cognizant of both the changes and the zeros. So we can take very efficient backups of the data that's changed. Obviously, first full and then incremental forever would be supported in this model. We then look at the metadata. Okay, what are we backing up? What does this workload look like? What applications are it running? Where can we put this within our environment that would be most advantageous for both ingest and recovery, right? Because we're not just dumping stuff into our system kind of stupidly. We're intelligently placing the data so that you can recover it, because that's kind of the point. We then ingest it over parallel using the iSCSI transport to the data services IP to make sure there's no single points of failure there. And then finally, run any kind of postscripts you might want before we release the snapshot. Delete it, clean up, all that kind of jazz. And then victory! Data's protected, you win, everyone's a winner. Cool? It's like not nerdy enough or too nerdy? Yeah, I saw some peace signs. Let's get nerdier. Specifically, there's some interesting new APIs within v3. I want to call out the VM snapshots, the VM_snapshots if you're a camel case nerd like I am. I'm more of a Pascal case guy myself, which allows you to bake in a lot of information about what you want to do with the snapshot, specifically all of this stuff, right? So you can tell the API a lot of interesting things about the specification, the metadata itself, and obviously the version. We call a few things specifically with the request. I've highlighted and bolded and put a few things red here that we need. Basically, like, give it a name, tell it what kind of snapshot it is. It's a VM snapshot running in Acropolis. We need the unique identifier. We need to know the entity unique identifier, which is held into the resources section. And duh, we're calling the 3.0 API. Right? So that's what you need to call it in case you're like, oh, I want to look at the developer site and look at the new API endpoint. The rest of it's kind of optional. Right? We can potentially call the app consistent or crash consistent piece, depending on what you want, but those are the bare bones that you need to support this. Right? And what it ends up looking like is a very simple workflow for doing granular per virtual machine, quiesced, change block tracking or change region tracking in this case, calls. I put an example here in PowerShell. I just thought it was neat because it's really simple, right? There's not a lot to it, which is what you want. You don't want something to be overly complex. And in the typical Nutanix fashion, all the v3 endpoints are exposed using Swagger, which has recently grown up. It's got its big boy pants on. It's called the OpenAPI 2.0 spec. So both for the cluster or the infrastructure endpoints, as well as the virtual machine or application type endpoints, they're all available. And I've had a treat going through the v3 APIs. So that's kind of the nerdy stuff. I think we should demo what's going down.
Do we want a demo?
Do you want a demo? Yeah. Okay, I guess that's a yes.
Fine, I'll oblige. All right. So I'm going to show you 3 things. Okay, so the first one is how easy it is to integrate with AHV. And then I'm going to take a VM that's already pre-created in AHV, and I'm going to apply an SLA policy, right? And then from there, I'm going to do a quick search and do a file level, basically download, right? I'm going to download a file that I'm pulling from that virtual machine that's been backed up.
Fingers crossed the internet's work.
Because
this is live.
All right. I think we can see that. All right, so I am logged into the Rubrik interface, right, to the UI. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to configure go right up here. I'm going to select Nutanix clusters. It's probably a little bit hard to read.
You want to make it bigger?
Yeah. So I already have one connected, right? So I wanted to pre-stage some stuff so that way it's not a 4-hour, I'm kidding, it's really fast. And so we're just going to go ahead and hit add. Pops up. Right, I enter my cluster name, my cluster UUID, username, password. At this point, you might go, cluster UUID, what? Where do I get that from? So it's actually pretty simple. You go into Prism, okay, and you just click right here, copy, paste, done. Okay, so nothing too crazy there. And then you're going to copy your CA certificate information from Prism into Rubrik. That way, validation is done, right? Validation checking. Now, before I get too crazy, I wanted to just show you in Prism. No trickery here. We are running AHV as our hypervisor. Okay.
Do you have anything up your sleeves?
I rolled them up so you could tell. Yeah. Drop down to VMs. Go to table. A couple of VMs created. So if we just search quickly, Rebecca, because I'm that self-obsessed, I wanted to name 2 VMs after yours truly. So we've got Rebecca Demo 2. Okay? They're live, they're real, they exist. So if we go back over here to Rubrik, our user interface, hit cancel, I already pre-configured everything. If I go under virtual machines and I go to AHV VMs, it's going to load all of the virtual machines that are auto-detected, right, from this cluster. Again, I can go ahead and search my name, pops up 2 VMs. Right now, I already have 1 VM, demo number 2. This one's already protected by Rubrik. I've been backing it up since last night, so I have several backups to choose from, right, for my restore. But then I have Rebecca Demo, and this one, notice right here that there is no SLA. It's unassigned. It's not being protected right now. So I can just simply click that, and I can manage protection. And I can go ahead and select one of these pre-created SLA policies, or if I wanted to, I can go ahead and create a new one. And this is going to dictate how often we are backing up your virtual machine. This is going to dictate brick-to-brick replication. This is going to dictate things like archival, right? Do I want to have archival to Azure or to S3, something like that, okay? Let's go ahead and cancel. Let's go ahead and protect it. Select gold, submit. Done. Right, now we're starting to protect your virtual machine, okay? Let's take a look at demo number 2. Since we've been protecting this one since last night, when I stayed up and installed Ubuntu in a virtual machine. And let's look at today. Right, I've got several snapshots here that I can choose from. So over here in the overview, I see I've got 36 total snapshots because I've been taking these very regularly since last night. Okay, so I can see the oldest one, I can see my newest one, I can see what domain, right, the SLA domain I'm using for protection. And that's, again, dictating all of those policies. Over here, I can, if I want to, select 6:40 a.m., and I can browse if I'm that brave and I know exactly where that file is located that I need to restore. Okay? If I'm not that brave but I know the name of the file, I can just simply do a quick search. Okay, find it. Awesome. Tells me I've got 36 versions of it, and then I pick which one I want to download. Right, so I can go ahead and select the newest one, download, and then whenever it's finished, right, it'll pop up and tell me, and I'm going to be able to go ahead and select it and download it. Short, sweet, simple. Right? That's kind of the beauty of Rubrik. Anything else I should show them?
I think that's fair. Do we have any questions while we have the demo available that we
Before
can take
I
now?
switch screens.
I think you might have to step up to the mic, just so it can be recorded for the virtual edition.
So the versions you just showed there, I noticed they were a few minutes apart. Are they? Is that due to the policy that you enforced, or is that happen to be the changes that were affected?
That's according to my policy.
Okay. See, easy enough. Thank you.
There you go. Any other questions? You have the demo up here? I think the underlying idea is that it is exactly that easy. It's we try to build these demos because I think they're kind of boring in a way, because it's like add some stuff, assign a policy, done. Because no one really wants to spend any significant amount of time in their backup product, right? You just want this stuff to run or potentially call the API and protect it. Cool.
Yep.
Question over here? Yes, sir. Do you have what kind of question?
So one is there a possibility to view the size of each snapshot for a specific VM? Is there anything that you have written for PowerShell if I want to automate something? And like, for example, if I can create a lab in its own environment and I want to use PowerShell to sort of manage on deploying it and managing the snapshots later on it, using PowerShell, right? And another one is if you have an SLA. So there's 3 questions. I'm sorry.
Well, let's answer those real quick, and then
Okay.
we'll get to, just so I don't forget what the questions were. Do you want to tackle the first one on the sizing? Or do you want me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, the first questions are on the size of a snapshot.
Of each snapshot.
Yeah, and we can obviously see the logical amount of data that's representing within that snapshot, but at the same time, it's going to our global dedupe and compression pool. So it doesn't represent any specifically or any specific fixed size within the system. It's more like, here's the logical size that you gave me, and then it dedupes and compresses it down to whatever the data efficiency rate is within the cluster. So short answer, yes. You can totally look and see, all right, this is a 30 gig snapshot, something like that, and it reduced to X amount of data. But that shouldn't be too
It's more how much data actually it's taken up in Rubrik. And the reason why I'm posing the question is because if I want to see which VM might be taking the most space and then which snapshot from there is taken up.
So the answer would be yes. The answer around the PowerShell is also yes. So we have a module that's available on GitHub that I've opened up to the community to contribute whatever flights your fancy, so to speak. If you want a command that's not currently in there, just submit a request like, hey, I want this, or write it and contribute it yourself. I think there's something like 25 or more something commands already in there today. And the idea is that I know a lot of administrators, myself included, like to use PowerShell for kind of day-to-day ops, and that's why it's there.
And just the last question.
Okay.
Because I had this happened to me. If you have an SLA of 2 months, for example, a daily SLA, but for some reason you want to keep a snapshot from snapshot that's about to expire, so you want to freeze it, but you don't want to necessarily extend your whole SLA for, I don't know, 1 year, because you might have multiple VMs in that. I know that's not possible now, but is that something maybe that you guys are gonna?
Actually, that is supported today. Yeah,
It
so
is?
you are able to export that piece of data so that it's no longer
Well,
under the duration of the SLA.
I understand that you can export it, but just to keep that specific snapshots without breaking the chain, and just for that one VM in SLA without exporting the actual data. Because if I have a VM, for example, that's 3 terabytes, exporting that it becomes a little bit.
Let's take that offline because it feels like a little bit more complex question for the audience. Question over there?
Yeah, hi, I was just wondering, if you already are using Nutanix protection domains, does this replace the protection domain, or will this automatically ingest the existing protection domains that you got in Nutanix for your backups?
So we're not looking at the protection domains as a driver for putting data into the system.
Yep.
The idea is that you've got probably a mixture of workloads, physical, virtual, et cetera, and that you control the SLAs through Rubrik. That being said, you can certainly call both systems, potentially have a driving workflow that says, if I have a protection domain within one, being Nutanix, go ahead and map that to an SLA in the second, being Rubrik, and we'll make sure that's protected. But there's no dependency between the two.
Okay.
Because once we take the data off the system, for
So
the
you can
actual
run this
backup and
independent
snapshot,
of your PDs.
we have it, yeah.
You're fine.
And that gives you all the other use cases such as global search and replication, archive, things like that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mhm.
And with that one as well, it really depends on what you're designing for, right? Because you could use one or the other or both. It just really
Sure.
depends on what your goal is.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Question over there?
I'm wondering if you could demo or speak to the SQL backups and how you can mount them up for restores or verification and that sort of thing.
Cool. That's a very popular one. I mean, from a, am I stealing your thunder there?
That's okay. We only have 5 minutes though.
Okay, so that was the last question. From a protection perspective, it can be virtualized on Windows, and we'll talk to it using the guest tools to quiesce and take the backups, things like that. If it's physical, we install a connector service that's really just kind of a glorified API translation layer. It talks to SQL on one side and kind of talks to the API on the other. It's 10 megabytes total in runtime, so it's pretty tiny. So that's on the protection side. Then restoring, you have lots of options. You can actually choose to restore the entire thing if it's a VM, various databases, instances, et cetera, if it's more granular at the physical level, or using something we just announced in Alta, our SQL Live Mount technology. You can take a database backup within the Rubrik system and actually present it to one or more SQL servers that are running today where there's no data migration, meaning that we just kind of magically appear to to obfuscate the IP underneath it, kind of just appear to the SQL Server as showing the LDFs and MDFs, et cetera, so that you can begin querying what the data is in there, so you can actually run ad hoc queries on the tables, restore pieces and bits, things like that, all the way through doing a schema update kind of idea check. What would happen if I updated the schema? Can I do a database health check, things like that. The nice thing there is that it is running kind of in the flash layer within the distributed Rubrik cluster, so you get performance out of it. We're not advocating that you just run all your SQL directly on us, but if you need to grab the data instantly, this is a few seconds and you have all the database data available to you, you can. We'll track the changes and ultimately throw it away if you desire, so that there's no impact on the production environment from both a performance and a capacity perspective. So there's many different ways you can slice and dice the SQL offering, and we've got a bunch of engineers and such at the booth who'd be happy to go deep on that. Okay, so I think we just got to complete this, and then we got to go because we're going to get the hook. Other questions after though, we'll be outside.
We'll be out there.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we've got 2 customer use cases, and I don't want to spend an abundance of time and bore you to death if you're hearing customer success stories, right? Got it.
Okay.
So we've got 2 of them, Tampa Bay, Rays, okay, for those of you who are basketball fans. And then we also have Gallagher. Okay, so this is out of EMEA, and then this one's also out of US. So the thing I really want to point out here is the second line here, and the first line here, right? That's the heart of what we do. We're trying to take something that was a complex problem and make it simple, and that's very complementary to what Nutanix is doing as well, right? So it's a very complementary architecture. We're supposed to tell you to fill out a survey.
You can win things.
Things. We don't know what kind of things. Maybe one of those things. Okay. And then, of course, please feel free to contact us. We did have a short session, so we're trying to compact a lot of information into a short period of time.
We've got some shirts too.
For those of you who did ask a question, you see that gentleman right there who's playing on his phone and ignoring us? Harass him for T-shirts, please.
Yeah, we've got a limited stash over there.
But we will be outside if you have any questions, or you can please come see us at the booth.
Right on. Rock on. Yay, have a fun conference.